I'd like to thank you for joining us again for this another episode of our series on Teaching Tuesdays. My name is Luis Espinosa and I'm the Director for the Office of Evangelization and Catechesis. Over the course of the past few weeks, we've been getting many questions in our office, and one of the more popular questions has been in regards to how long does it take for a seminarian to become a priest, especially since we already experienced the ordination of Caleb de la Rosa as a transitional deacon, and we look forward to Genaro Garza, who will be ordained also a transitional deacon in August. And so as we keep them in mind in prayer, just to share a little bit about the process and how many years does it usually take for a candidate to eventually get ordained a priest, if it's God's will that he becomes ordained to serve in the diocese as a priest. And so one of the things that we have to go back in time and see is that really the reform of how the formation of a priest and the formation of a candidate has been really, we go back to Vatican II. But going a little bit beyond Vatican II, we go back to the Synod of 1990, more or less. And so at that time, St. John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, he called a synod. And in the synod, they focused specifically on the formation of priests and looking at what formation would look like in our seminaries throughout the world, throughout the church. And so as a response to the findings and the discussion and dialogue that they had at the synod, John Paul II publishes Pastores dabo vobis, this apostolic exhortation, I will give you shepherds. And so in this exhortation, he reminded all of us, he reminded the bishops, the priests, the laity, of what was the responsibility, what was even the outline and the scope of what a priest is, reminding all the priests of who they are as taking on this new role in the church, of becoming in a special way the head of the mystical body, as how they were called to be just like Christ, especially in the celebration of Mass and the sacraments. But in this document, Pastores dabo vobis, John Paul II outlined what we would eventually get in the United States as a program for formation of priests. And in this, he outlined certain things, but in a special way, he gave us what we now as laity also see as the 4 pillars. And so these 4 pillars are 4 key areas that are important and necessary for all candidates to the priesthood, but also for us as a laity, is to be better formed as lay ecclesial ministers. And so those 4 pillars are very simple: the human, intellectual, spiritual, and community. And so these 4 pillars are those things that help us to get closer to God, but closer to each other. But I do want to focus on the one that's intellectual. And the intellectual is the one most people ask questions about, because when we're talking about formation of priests, that's really what's going to help guide us in understanding how long is that process for a candidate. And so typically the question is usually even before they even consider to go into seminary, is that there's a process, there's an admission process, there's a discernment as to, is God calling, where the candidate would say, is God calling me to the priesthood, or is God calling me to another vocation? And so part of this discernment process is looking at the diocese. In our case, we have a director of vocations to say, can you help guide me to see if God is calling me to the priesthood? Or when we look at the other vocations, is God calling me to the single life, to the married life, or even religious life? And so part of this discernment process is attending retreats and having dialogues and discussions, even if we could have a spiritual director. So going forward, as part of that admission process, it is a requirement that a physical be taken care of a physical evaluation, but also a psychological evaluation before they're even considered to be part of the diocese as a seminarian. And so I say this because it's important for us to know this, that one of the other requirements before a person is admitted as a seminarian in a diocese is to make sure that they're fully initiated, and so that they have been baptized, that they have been confirmed and received Eucharist to be able to join or become a part of the diocese as a seminarian. And so going back to that time frame and looking at how long does it usually take. And so when we talk about time, it varies. And so I tend to say as a minimum, we look at 6 years. 6 years and even beyond 6 years. Why do I say 6 years? Because it really depends on the formation of the individual. If we go back and we talk about that pillar, intellectual pillar that I was talking about earlier, is that part of the process, part of the preparation is making sure that the person knows what the church believes and teaches. And so usually this means looking at 2 core areas, and we usually talk about philosophy and theology. So for the most part, these are the 2 key areas that the formation will revolve around, again, philosophy and theology. And so we take anybody, for example, and we say, okay, what kind of formation do they have? Are they coming out of high school? And so we see those coming out of high school typically would go into a college seminary and would study philosophy. And after 4 years would continue with their studies in a theologate in theology for another possible 4 years. But if a person already comes with a bachelor's, so one of the key questions that is asked is, okay, from your bachelor's, did you study philosophy? And was it at a Catholic school or university? What kind of a theology background do you have? And so some cases, a person may be asked to go through a pre-theology program, looking at philosophy, and then continuing the process with their theologate or theology classes. So that's why it says, as a minimum, is looking at 6 years. So that by the time ordination comes around, when we talk about priesthood ordination, then at that point in time, potentially every ordained priest in the diocese has at least a master's. And so if they don't have a bachelor's, they prepare with a bachelor's first, concentrating in philosophy, and then work towards their master's of divinity in the most cases. In others, it's both a master's of divinity or a master's of arts, both ands. And so usually that's part of that intellectual growth. But when we talk about the other pillars, it's knowing that these other pillars are going to be taken care of by the seminary and by the diocese, by the director of vocations. So making sure that there's some requirements have been met. We also have to think about and consider is that before a seminarian can be ordained a deacon, part of the process is for them to go on what they call a canonical retreat. A retreat to be able to take time, even in silence, to consider, is God calling me to the priesthood or not? And so you're going to notice that most of the priests, and now we look at Deacon Caleb and future Deacon Genaro Garza, is that they have gone through the canonical retreat before getting ordained as a deacon. And that part of the process is they also have to go through a rite called candidacy. But before they're able to go through that rite of candidacy, they also need to get instituted as a lector, instituted as an acolyte before they're able to do that. And so we will notice that at this point in time, both Caleb and Genaro had already gone through that candidacy period, had already received and been instituted as lectors and acolytes, and getting ordained deacon is the next step in their preparation, God willing that they will get ordained next year as a priest. And so I wanted to share that with you guys because that was one of several questions that has been asked, especially most recently, is that there is a process, there is a time, but I want to also close by talking more about vocations. One of the other things that John Paul II in Pastores dabo vobis talked about is whose responsibility is it to be able to talk about vocations? So in the end, it's all of our responsibility. Each person in the church has their own role and responsibility to talk about vocation, about how they're going to serve others when they get older. And so when we talk about who are those persons directly responsible, We can consider the bishop, like I mentioned before, the director of vocations, the pastor, the priests, the deacons, catechists, mom and dad. It's all our responsibility to talk about and help our children, our young people, and even our young adults to stop, think about, what is God calling me to do with my life? How does God want me to serve Him and His church? So again, talking about the different states, the different vocations. So I mentioned earlier, when we talk about vocations, we do talk about priesthood, but we also talk about religious life, single life, and married life. And sometimes I throw in a fifth one, which is permanent diaconate, the permanent deacons that we have in our diocese, in that this was an order that was restored from Vatican II. In that we didn't have deacons before as we have now as permanent deacons. That was something that was part of the early church, and that got brought back into our life of the church after Vatican II, that it became a permanent state. And so vocations, it's everybody's business. And all of us should be praying and thinking about having that conversation, having that dialogue even with our children and our young people. What is God calling you to do in your life or with your life? Is God calling you to be a priest? Is God calling you to be a religious brother or sister? Is God calling you to be a single person, a married person? What is God's plan for you? And so don't be afraid to ask that question. Some of us may be surprised at what the answers will be. But the point is we need to ask that question. What is God calling you to be? What is God calling you? How is God calling you to serve Him and the church?